إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our course on Ibn Hajar's Nukhbat al-Fikar towards understanding the core concepts in Hadith theory. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, we continue from where we left off with our level 2 Ulum al-Hadith course. Our course outcomes are to understand Hadith and its role in Islam, to master standard Hadith terminology, and to understand Hadith as far as preservation, transmission, and authentication is concerned, insha'Allah ta'ala. In this lesson, we will be looking at a continuation of our previous discussion, the further categorization of Ahad. This time, however, we will look specifically at Ahad in terms of its level of authenticity. So Hadith classification based on Sahih specifically. So what makes a Hadith authentic, and what exactly is authenticity as far as traditional Islam is concerned? What are those conditions? We will look at them individually bi-idhnillah ta'ala, and then afterwards we will look at the difference between the different ranks of Sahih Hadith, insha'Allah ta'ala. What we have covered so far, we've covered a variety of discussions as an introductory trajectory towards Hadith terminology. We've looked at what is a Hadith, given a brief introduction there. Then the origin story of Hadith, when, why, and how were they transmitted, documented, and preserved. Then we looked at writing of Hadith as a means of preservation as opposed to the oral tradition of Hadith transmission. And proceeding from there, we looked at the different stages of writing, from informal writing to formal writing. Then the various genres of Hadith literature, including the Musannaf literature, the Musnad literature, the Sahih and Sunan movements, and then the history of Hadith criticism, which is essentially where we are at present. What exactly started this transformation of the science? The emergence of fabrication and the methods that our scholars had employed to counteract fabrication. We've also analyzed the contemporary approach by Dr. Jonathan Brown, just describing the classical method, and this has led us to the study of Hadith terminology directly from Ibn Hajar's Nukhbat al-Fikar. And alhamdulillah, in the previous lesson, we've covered a number of concepts, including the division between a hadith as far as the number of chains are concerned. So we looked at where there is no specific limit to the number of chains, but rather it is narrated by a number of transmitters in every generation to the point where it provides us with definitive knowledge that is referred to as mutawatir, or a massively transmitted hadith. All other types of hadith form part of the ahad category, or solitary narrations, which of course doesn't always mean that it is solitary in reality, but it has any type of number of chains that does not meet the rank of mutawatir. That includes mashhur, which is at least 3 at every level, aziz, which is at least 2 at every level, and gharib, which goes down to at least 1 at every level, or at least one of the levels. And then of course there's a difference between an absolute gharib hadith, or fard al-mutlaq, or a hadith that is gharib, meaning there's a single transmitter at one stage, but that's only on one particular version of that transmission. It is a relative term, so we'll discuss that further bi-idhnillahi ta'ala as we proceed. Now moving on to the next segment of text from the Nukhba. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم وخبر الآحاد. So now remember, we spoke about Ahad. Ahad, of course, referring to this entire genre over here. Anything that is not mutawatir, right, is going to be considered ahad. So we are speaking about the overwhelming majority of ahadith that that don't qualify as being mutawatir. And again, mutawatir is very limited. Some scholars say about 400, some say less than that. So when it comes to ahadith, generally, we don't need to classify it as mutawatir and ahad. If it is mutawatir, then a special note would be added to say that this hadith is mutawatir. But the default assumption is that the hadith that you are dealing with is going to be khabrul ahad. It's going to be one of the categories of ahad. Which one it is exactly has no implications on the authenticity of the hadith. So whether the hadith is mashhur, whether it is aziz, whether it is gharib, any of these subcategories of ahad could still be categorized further in terms of its authenticity. And that's what we are looking at in this segment of text, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani mentions, وَخَبَرُ الْآحَادِ بِنَقْلِ عَدْلٍ تام الضبط متصل السند غير معلل ولا شاذ هو الصحيح لذاته وتتفاوت رتبته بتفاوت هذه الأوصاف ومن ثم قدم صحيح البخاري ثم مسلم ثم شرطهما. It's a two-liner, but it contains so much information, and this is the nature of this matan, this text that we are dealing with. Lots of information compacted in a concise form so that a student can have a brief overview of the entire spectrum of hadith terminology. What he's defining here, we'll translate it literally and then analyze it a few times as we proceed. Khabrul ahad, solitary transmissions if you'd like, is binaqli adlin, when it comes via transmission of adlin, a person of integrity, tamid dabti, that possesses excellent preservation skills, muttasil as-sanadi, that comes via a chain that is perfectly connected from the very beginning till the end, ghayra mu'allalin, that contains no hidden defects, wala shadhin, and that contains no anomalies, meaning it is not contradictory to that which is more authentic than it. It would be categorized as huwa as-sahihu lidhatihi, it is authentic in and of itself. وَتَتَفَاوَتُ رُتْبَتُهُ, its ranking, meaning the ranking of a sahih hadith, tatafawat, is various. There are a number of different ranks of a sahih hadith. بِتَفَاوُتِ هَذِهِ الْأَوْصَافِ, and that would be categorized based on these descriptions that we've mentioned up here. وَمِن ثَمَّ, and from this point, قُدِّمَ الصَّحِيحُ الْبُخَارِي, we would give preference to the ahadith found in the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, ثُمَّ Muslim, then the hadith in the Sahih of Imam Muslim, ثُمَّ شَرْطُهُمَا, then the ahadith that are in accordance with the conditions set out by Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim. Now, based on what Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani just taught us, there are a number of questions that we need to essentially ask in order to determine whether a hadith is sahih or not. Excuse me. So the first question is, does each transmitter possess adala? Does each transmitter in the chain in question possess adala? What is adala? It is integrity. So we would look at a particular chain. This is the example of the chain that we utilized as an example in the first class. And this hadith represents al-musalsal bil-awwaliyah. Excuse me. So the hadith al-musalsal bil-awwaliyah is the hadith that is usually the first one to be transmitted by a teacher to the students. And it reads, الراحمون يرحمهم الرحمن ارحموا من في الأرض يرحمكم من في السماء. The merciful ones, the most merciful has mercy on them. Have mercy on those in the earth, and then the one in the heavens will have mercy on you. Excuse me. Now, the point here is not to discuss the hadith and its implications here. What we are looking at, though, is the list of questions that one would have to ask as a scholar, as a student of hadith, in order to determine its authenticity. The first question is, does each transmitter possess adala, integrity? The second question is, does each transmitter possess tamud dabt, complete or excellent preservation skills? The third question, does each transmitter meet, or rather did each transmitter meet the one before and the one after? In other words, is the chain contiguous, which would refer to ittisalu sanad, a connected chain? The fourth question, is the chain free from hidden defects? Now, this requires a comparison with other chains in order to determine hidden defects. Hidden defects is any of the recognized defects that would render a hadith problematic. Which level of problem is what we're going to be discovering throughout this course, inshallah ta'ala. But the idea here is that at face value, the hadith looks fine. But when compared to other chains of transmission for the same hadith, then one would notice that there's a discrepancy in this chain or there's a discrepancy in that chain that you cannot detect unless you compare asanid. So that's a hidden defect. Now, for a hadith to be sahih, it must be free of hidden defects. And then the final question is the report free from contradictions with more reliable chains or reports? Meaning, does the text here, does it contradict more authentic narrations? Does it contradict the Quran, for example? If so, then the entire hadith would be regarded as inauthentic. In fact, it would be regarded as extremely weak. But be that as it may, these are the 5 questions based on the definition of a sahih hadith. Let's further analyze them, inshallah ta'ala. For a hadith to be sahih, right? Sahih lidhatihi is a key term here, because not only are we defining authenticity, right? But we are also saying that you get different types of authenticity. This is the absolute form of authenticity. As-sahih lidhatihi. In and of itself, this narration that contains all of these qualities or all of these conditions, it would be regarded as authentic by itself. You need no other evidence. You need no other supportive chains. The chain in front of you meets the level of authenticity by itself. So that's sahih lidhatihi. This is, of course, indicative of the fact that there will be other forms of sahih that we are not dealing with yet, because we are taking it one step at a time, inshallah ta'ala. So what are those conditions? As Ibn Hajar had highlighted for us, and we need to memorize this, it is خبر الآحاد بنقل عدل تام الضبط متصل السند غير معلل ولا شاذ. That is the definition that we need to memorize. The components of this definition allows us to discuss what exactly a sahih hadith is. So the first point that he mentions was binaqli adlin. It must come from a transmitter of integrity, right? Tamid dabti. He needs to have excellent preservation skills. That was number 2. Muttasil as-sanadi. The chain must be contiguous, so there must be no gaps in the chain of transmission. غير معلل or غير معلن. It must not contain any hidden defects. And ولا شاذ. It must not be anomalous, contradicting that which is more authentic. Now, taking from the Nuzhatun Nazar, which is Ibn Hajar's own commentary on the Nukhbat al-Fikar, we can see some descriptions. Now, it's quite small on the slide, but it's intended to be a note for those registered for the course. But what we'll do here, inshallah ta'ala, is we'll zoom into each one. So the first condition is integrity. And as far as integrity is concerned, the meaning of integrity is given in the text on screen here. Al-adalatu or al-adlu wal-adala. What is integrity and a person of integrity? Wal-muradu bil-adl. What is intended by integrity is man lahu malakatun. It is a transmitter with a quality تحمله على ملازمة التقوى والمروءة. A transmitter that has apparent taqwa. He fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, والمروءة, and his character is unblemished. وَالْمُرَادُ بِالتَّقْوَى, what is intended by taqwa in this context is اجتناب الأعمال السيئة, that it generally refrains from evil actions, min shirkin, polytheism, أو فسق, or manifest sins, أو بدعة, or innovation in religion. Now, when it comes to measuring somebody's integrity, naturally this creates a problem in terms of investigation and in terms of judgment. We don't truly know the state of somebody's taqwa. So how then would the scholars verify the integrity of a transmitter? Now, when it comes to corroboration and finding out how precise a narrator is, that's a very scientific, a very calculated methodology. But when it comes to judging somebody's integrity, what we apply really is the principle of nahkum bil-dhawahir. We judge based on what is apparent. We don't know the true state of somebody's heart, the true state of somebody's connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Islam does not burden us with that responsibility. Instead, what we are duty bound with is to take somebody at face value. If there's a Muslim that's generally not known to be a person of shirk, to be a person of open or manifest sin, right? His sin is not public knowledge. And he's not a person of bid'ah. He doesn't have some sort of religious innovation where he attributes things to Islam or to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam or to any facet of Islam that is not of Islam. If somebody is generally free from those factors, then they are regarded as a person of integrity. So this may seem, at face value, it may seem like a very low standard. But when it comes to the application among scholars, right, scholars of hadith were very stringent as far as their standards were concerned. So if a narrator was, for example, a person who treated animals cruelly, or who perhaps urinated in the street and he did so publicly, people saw him, then this would be enough of a blemish for the scholars to say this person he's got questionable integrity. So they would pause as far as the acceptance of that transmitter is concerned. Now, there's generally only one way of determining this for us, and that is to look at the biographical information of a particular narrator. Now, as difficult as it may be to imagine, but all of the transmitters of hadith, they have some level of biography recorded about them. The scholars have recorded their dates of birth, their dates of death, the place where they were born, the places where they traversed during their journey of seeking knowledge. They would have recorded their teachers and their students, and their contemporaries would have given some biographical testification about them. And it is based on these biographies that we can say things like, such a person was a very good businessman, or this person dedicated their life to jihad, or this person was a very precise narrator, or this person was an extremely erudite scholar, and so on and so forth. So the biographical testifications of their contemporaries play a huge role as far as determining their integrity is concerned. Now, in the grand scheme of things, because it is very difficult to be too analytical when it comes to somebody's integrity, the only time when a scholar's integrity would be called into question is if there is a clear and reliable report against that narrator. So we don't need to find testification of such and such a narrator was brilliant, or they were a person of tahajjud, or a person of dhikr, and so on. We don't need that level of detail in order to say this person had integrity. But rather, the absence of any vilification of that narrator is somewhat sufficient to say we can trust this narrator in a general sense. So that's essentially what adala refers to. Now we move on from adala, and the second condition that was mentioned is dabt. Now specifically when it comes to dabt or precision, we are not looking at anything but the precision as far as hadith is concerned. Now this can be in one of two ways. When a transmitter narrates or transmits hadith, he can either do so by way of memory or by way of writing. right? So we spoke already about the preservation style, whether that be through an oral transmission, so he hears the hadith and he memorizes it and he transmits it from memory, or through a written transmission. And we've spoken about the development from the one to the other. Now, later when writing became a ubiquitous form of hadith preservations, scholars would sometimes specifically rely on writing and not their memory to transmit hadith. Then we would have a special categorization for this type of preservation. So when it comes to dabt or precision, right, and preservation, the scholars have two subcategories here. The one is dabt as-sadr, where it's preservation from the heart. وهو أن يثبت ما سمعه بحيث يتمكن من استحضاره متى شاء. Preservation by way of memory is that a scholar can establish what he had heard, can preserve what he had heard, such that he is able to recall what he had heard whenever he so desires. So at the drop of a hat, or on demand, he's able to recall exactly what he had transmitted. The other option is وَضَبْطُ كِتَابٍ, right? ضَبْطُ كِتَابٍ means that he had excellent preservation standards for his writing of hadith. وَهُوَ, this is صِيَانَتُهُ, it is his ability to preserve لديه, right? His own ability to preserve منذ سمع فيه, since the time that he had heard a particular hadith. وَصَحَّحَهُ, and he preserved it and transmitted it perfectly إلى أن يؤدي منه, till the time that he can actually transmit from his writing. وَقُيِّدَ بِالتَّامِ, this quality of dabt has been restricted to تام الضبط, right? Perfect or excellent preservation. إشارة, this gives us an indication إلى الرتبة العليا في ذلك, that this is the highest level of preservation. So the quality is dabt, the quality is precision and preservation. When you speak about tamud dabt, we are obviously saying that if this is excellent preservation, that this is the highest form, but that also gives an indication that there are lesser forms of preservation, where somebody's preservation or the accuracy in transmission is not of the highest forms, but it is less than that. We are not speaking about the lower categories here. We are only speaking about the highest category, which is tamud dabt. So that was the second quality of a Sahih hadith, that the transmitters must all be people of integrity, number one, and people of precision or accurate preservation, number two. So adala and dabt. So looking at that now, we've covered two of the 5 conditions. The first one, adl or integrity, and the second one, tamul dabt or excellent preservation. Now, both of these qualities of a Sahih hadith, this is in relation to the narrator or the transmitter of the hadith. We now move on to the third quality, which is muttasil as-sanad, that the sanad, the chain of transmission, we've already explained what that is. In case you forgot, the chain of transmission is where you have the scholar who records the hadith, like Imam Tirmidhi, he gives us his sanad. So he transmits it from his teacher, Muhammad ibn Yahya ibn Abi Umar al-Adani, from Sufyan ibn Uyayna, from Amr ibn Dinar, from Qabus, from Abdullah ibn Umar, from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. This here is the chain or the isnad or the sanad of the hadith. The matan, just to recall your memory again, is the actual words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam or whoever the hadith is attributed to. Okay? Now, ittisalu sanad is when the hadith has a contiguous chain. What exactly is a contiguous chain? It is ma, that which salima isnaduhu, its chain is perfect or sound, min suqutin, it's free from any drops, from any missing links, fihi. Bihaythu, such that yakunu kullum min rijalihi, each one of the transmitters in the chain, sami'a dhalika al-marwiyya, he heard that transmission, that report, min shaykhihi, from his teacher. Was-sanadu, and the chain of transmission, tuqaddam تقدم تعريفه. We've already explained what that meant, what that means, and we've just given a revision of that as well. So how does one determine a contiguous chain? Isn't it a given that if you find a chain of transmission, so for example, again, if you find that Imam Tirmidhi says he heard it from Ibn Abi Umar, from Sufyan, from Amr ibn Dinar, from Qabus, from Abdullah ibn Amr, isn't this an automatic declaration that each person heard that from his teacher? No, it is not. Because you may have an instance, and this is how we detect forgery, this is how we detect discrepancies in the chain. If there is any gap in this particular sanad, it will be detected by one of two ways. The one is that it's apparent. So you can actually see a particular narrator says, I heard it from someone. He doesn't say who, he just says, I heard it from someone. That for us is a missing link. Now, nothing of that sort is being mentioned here. The other option is you have a chain. On the face value, it seems like everybody met, the person before them. But if we examine the dates, right? If we examine the dates when each narrator was born and when each narrator passed away, then we will be able to determine, is it actually possible that each transmitter met the teacher and met the student? And if it is not possible for them to have met, then there must be a link between the teacher and the student, or the teacher and the apparent student, that is not being mentioned in the chain because it's impossible for the two of them to have met. And because there's a missing link and we don't know who the missing link is, that renders the chain problematic. Hence, a chain being contiguous is an essential element of a Sahih Hadith. So we look at it again. He says, وَالْمُتَّصِل, that which is connected, is مَا سَلِمَ إِسْنَادُهُ, is when the chain of transmission is free مِنْ سُقُوتٍ, from any drops in the chain, بِحَيْثُ يَكُونُ كُلٌّ مِنْ رِجَالِهِ, such that all of the transmitters سَمِعَ ذَلِكَ الْمَرْوِيَّ مِنْ شَيْخِهِ, had in fact heard that transmission from the teacher. Now, scholars had different approaches as far as contiguity is concerned. Imam al-Bukhari, known to have the most stringent conditions for accepting a hadith as being authentic, he demanded proof or evidence that every person in the chain in fact met the person before and the person after. So he actually wanted to see evidence that there was a meeting that took place between the two of them. Now, such evidence is going to need more than just their dates of birth and the dates of death. Evidence such as that requires for us to actually go into their biography and see not only did they live in a time where it was possible to meet one another, but they also moved through an area where they were both present at the same time. So, for example, they met on Hajj, or for example, they met because they lived in the same city, or because they passed through the same city around the same time, or because there's evidence of a gathering in which both of them were present and they both transmitted the same thing, and so on and so forth. So again, the biographical information of the narrators is required in order to establish ittisalu sanad, or contiguity in the chain of transmission. Most scholars, however, do not demand that there be evidence for a meeting to have taken place. Remember, such evidence isn't always easy to come by. Think about it in our day, right? If you don't know the scholars of the world personally, can you, just by knowing that they all exist at the same time, have evidence that they met each other, right? So you can think of scholars that live right now. Do you know with certainty that this scholar met that scholar because they live in the same time? No. Perhaps if you know that they were both at a particular conference and they both presented a paper at that conference, then you have evidence that they met. So such evidence isn't always easy to come by, and thus that level of stringency is quite high. Most scholars were somewhat satisfied and contented with the possibility of those scholars having met. Because remember, you're dealing here with not just random individuals saying, I transmit from so-and-so. Each transmitter we already know something about that transmitter. We know that the person has integrity, and we know that the person has precision. Why do we know that? We know that based on corroboration, and we know that based on biographical information. Once you have that information, then when a Muslim like that says, I heard so-and-so transmit, and there's biographical evidence to show that it was in fact possible for them to have met, then from that point we take it that they have in fact met. Why? Because we know and trust the person, and we've got some evidence to rely upon. So that would be the standard procedure for most scholars. Now we move on to the next condition. Just to reiterate, we've covered 3 so far. Each transmitter must be a person of integrity. Each transmitter must have excellent preservation skills. And number 3, the chain itself must be contiguous. It must have no missing links whatsoever. And it must either be either be proven that it was possible for them to have met, or a more stringent approach, you must have evidence that they actually met. The next condition of a Sahih Hadith is غير معلن or غير معلل. It must not be containing any hidden defects. What is this exactly? He says in the Sharh of the Nukhba, in Nuzhat al-Nadhr, وَالْمُعَلَّل, a defective hadith, لغة, literally defective means ما فيه علة, that which has a defect. واصطلاحا, but the technical istilahi term, so mustalah al-hadith, you deal with istilahat, terminology or jargon or nomenclature. According to the nomenclature of al-Ulum al-hadith, mu'allal means ما فيه علة خفية قادحة. It is that which possesses a defect that is hidden and that causes the hadith to be rendered as problematic. So only when a hadith can be proven to be free of such defects, then we can say with confidence that the hadith is in fact authentic. And this is an important note in terms of a contemporary application of the science. When we as students learn the science of ulum al-hadith, one must eventually get to a point where you can apply some of the principles of the science to a certain extent. So for example, as you become more and more familiar with the terminology and the literature, you start exercises of examining a particular chain of transmission. Now, a very rudimentary type of examination would be to take a particular chain and one by one go through every transmitter in that chain to determine the transmitter's integrity and the transmitter's precision. In other words, you look for those two qualities together, and collectively, adala and dabt refers to or is referred to by the collective term thiqa. And we've mentioned this before, and I'll continue mentioning this because it's an important term that is essential for a student of ulum al-hadith. A student of ulum al-hadith wants to examine a chain of transmission, so he goes through a book such as he goes to the Taqrib of Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and the Taqrib al-Tahdhib it's like the most concise work on biographical information of narrators, as it only contains the transmitters of the 6 reliable books, the Sihah Sitta, which refers to Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, and Ibn Majah. So it's got all of the transmitters of the 6 books. So as a start, you look through the book and you try to find each transmitter. The easy part is to actually determine whether each transmitter is a thiqa or not, because Ibn Hajar will tell you in the Taqrib he's a thiqa or he's layyinul hadith. He's going to give you some sort of classification of each transmitter. Once you have all of that, at face value, the hadith may seem authentic. But that's only the first 2 of the 5 conditions of Sahih. So you only have 2, adala and dabt. Why? Because you've got thiqa, thiqa, thiqa. But the rest of the conditions, those will only be discernible with a bit more advanced knowledge, as you'll see here, because for a hadith to be free of defects, you can only detect such hidden defects. The very nature of something being hidden is that it's not apparent, it's not easy to discern. You can only detect such hidden defects with further investigation and corroboration. In other words, by comparing different chains of transmission to see if they are consistent across the board, or if some of the chains expose certain weaknesses in other. And Allah knows best. So that's 4 of the 5 conditions of a Sahih Hadith. Let's look at them again. We've got adl, integrity, tamud dabt, excellent preservation, muttasil as-sanad, it must have a contiguous chain, ghayra mu'alin, it must not have any defects, specifically hidden defects, wala shadh, and it must not be anomalous. What does that mean? Anomalous, or for the hadith to contain shudhudh, for it to be shadh, وَالشَّاذُ لُغَةً, lexically this means al-munfarid. It is anomalous, it is different to everything else. وَاصْطِلَاحًا, according to the nomenclature of ulum al-hadith, مَا يُخَالِفُ فِيهِ الرَّاوِي مَنْ هُوَ أَرْجَحُ مِنْهُ. It is when a transmitter, he differs or contradicts other transmitters who are more reliable than him. وَلَهُ تَفْسِيرٌ آخر سيأتي, and it has a further sort of elaboration that will come somewhat later on. Now, shadh can be in a variety of forms. Anomalies can exist where one transmitter says that the hadith comes from a particular source, but all the other transmitters, they give a different source, right? For example, one transmitter says the hadith comes from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he says his teacher transmits from another teacher, from a sahabi, from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the other chains of transmission indicate that he was the only one who attributed the narration to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasallam. All the other chains, which are reliable, their transmitters stated that this hadith stops at the level of the sahabi. So it does not go back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is not marfu', it is not lifted up to the Prophet ﷺ. It is in fact mawquf, it stops at the level of the companions. Now again, you can only detect this by corroboration, which is exactly what the scholars of hadith did. So when comparing all of the transmissions, even though in all of them you have narrators who are possessors of adala and dabt, in all of them you have ittisalu sanad, so you have contiguous chains throughout. But in one particular transmission, you have a transmitter who says that it goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, while in the rest of them it says that it goes to the Sahabi. So that would be an anomaly, right? That chain would be regarded as anomalous. So you don't regard that hadith or that particular chain of the hadith as authentic. Why? Because there is some level of shadh contained therein. Again, there are various ways that it can be shadh. Sometimes a hadith can be transmitted with all of the conditions in place, but the text of the hadith actually contradicts a more authentic hadith, or it even contradicts the Quran. Very rarely would you have such a case, but if that is the case, and it can be proven that there's no way to synthesize between the two, and it's an actual contradiction, then of course that which is less authentic will be kicked out as being shadh, and that renders it no longer authentic, but in fact extremely weak. So for the hadith to be regarded as authentic, this 5th condition means that it must be free from these forms of anomalies, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So there are our 5 conditions in detail. Let's look at it another time, inshallah ta'ala, just as a form of revision, along with some translation to help us along the way. What does it mean for the hadith to be authentic? It means that it must be transmitted by transmitters who have adala. What is adala? Adala is trustworthiness or integrity. What does it consist of? It consists of the narrator or transmitter being a Muslim, having reached the age of puberty, having full faculties of intellect, so he must have aql. He must possess general taqwa, meaning he must not be known to have committed a major sin, and he must not be known to be a person who has a flawed character or somebody who persists in minor sins. Now, we don't know the reality of people's relationships with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so we judge by what is apparent. If nothing if nothing untoward is known about that particular transmitter, he's accepted at face value to be a person of integrity. The next condition is tamud dabt, to have complete accuracy, right? So we're down here by number 2. There's no space on the next slide. You'll see that in a moment. So tamud dabt, which is over here, it is complete accuracy or excellent preservation. This can either be at the level of accurate memorization. So he hears something and he transmits it exactly as he heard it, but only relying on his memory. Or dabtul kitaba, meaning he's got excellent preservation skills of his book. There are examples of scholars who they transmitted by way of writing, but then the writing material burned down. Abdullah ibn Lahi'a is an example of this. A good narrator, a good transmitter, but he relied on his writing. Then his library burns down, and of course now, because he relied on his writing, we can no longer regard him as a reliable transmitter. So that is generally a discussion that we learn about with some transmitters like Abdullah ibn Lahi'a. So that's just an example. So according to the Nukhba, according to the Nuzhatun Nazar, which is also by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the commentary on the book that we are studying, he says, ضبط الصدر, right, precision of memory, هو يثبت ما سمعه بحيث يتمكن من استحضاره متى شاء. We've mentioned this before. He establishes what he heard by way of memory, such that he's able to recall whenever he so wills. Otherwise, he relies on his writing, ضبط كتاب. وهو صيانته لديه منذ سمع فيه. He has preservation of his writing from the time that he heard it. وصححه, he established that it is in fact accurate, and it remains accurate إلى أن يؤدي منه, until he can transmit from it. وقيد بالتام, this quality of dabt is restricted with the condition of it being tam or complete or excellent. إشارة إلى الرتبة العليا, as an indication that this is the highest level of preservation. What exactly is dabt? He defines it here as, and this is from Shaykh Nuruddin Itir and his specific footnotes from the Sharh of the Nukhba. It is ملكة تؤهل الراوي لأن يروي الحديث كما سمعه. Dabt is essentially the ability of a narrator or transmitter to transmit the hadith exactly as he heard it. So tamud dabt is the condition for a sahih hadith. Now I want you to remember this. Not only memorize the definition, but I want you to specifically remember the meaning of each of the conditions. When it comes to dabt, that becomes extremely important for the next part of our discussion, inshallah ta'ala. In this case, for a sahih hadith, don't just remember dabt, but remember tamud dabt, right? Excellent preservation. And then we said the third condition is ittisalu sanad, or the sanad, the isnad must be muttasil, it must be contiguous. What does that mean? It must have a connected chain, and we know this by either imkaniyatul liqa, the possibility of each transmitter having met the one before and the one after, or thubutul liqa, where we have evidence of an established meeting between each transmitter. So the general approach and the approach of Imam Muslim is to have imkanul liqa, the possibility of a meeting based purely on the biographies and the dates of birth and the dates of death of every transmitter. Thubutul liqa is an established meeting where we know, based on evidence, that the two transmitters had met, and that is one of the stringent conditions laid down by Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala. Number 4 was ilal, right? The hadith must be free from hidden defects. This means that where conditions 1 to 3 are met, so there's adala, there's tamud dabt, there's contiguous or rather contiguity in the chain. But when you compare the chain to other chains of transmission, we see that there's differences here that indicate there are hidden defects that we couldn't initially detect. So once again, at the basic level of simply looking through a chain of transmitters and determining that each one is a thiqah, you can be completely oblivious to the hidden defects. Ilal is a science of far more depth than ulumul hadith, right? It's a sub-branch of the sciences of Hadith, and there are specific works dedicated to detecting hidden defects within chains of transmission. So what we are discussing here is the fact that being free from hidden defects is a condition of a Sahih Hadith. And then finally, again, it must be free of shudud. What is shadh? Shaykh Nuruddin Itri defines it for us. He says, عُرِفَ الشاذ بأنه ما يخالف فيه الراوي من هو أرجح منه. It is when a transmitter contradicts someone who is more authentic or more reliable than him. والمشهور, what is famous in relation to shadh, أنه ما يخالف فيه الراوي الثقة. It is that which a reliable narrator contradicts من هو أرجح منه, someone who is more reliable than him. وانظر ما ذكر أنه سيأتي. And we will also mention again later on when we speak about shadh and munkar and mahfudh and so forth. Those are another categorization, but we'll talk about that later. Shadh, for our purposes now, essentially means it does not contradict higher evidence or more reliable evidence. It mustn't contradict a stronger hadith, and it mustn't contradict a number of similar strength hadith. So like I said, you may have one authentic transmission and it goes against 5 other authentic transmissions. So in that case, it's shadh, not because the 5 are more authentic than it, but because you have 5 against 1. In another instance, you may have one authentic transmission, but another that is definitively more authentic than it. So you only have 2, but the one is more authentic than the other. Then the one that is shadh or anomalous would be regarded as problematic in that instance as well. So now that we've got all of this information under wraps, let's look at an example of a Sahih Hadith based on what we've just learned. In this instance, we have a hadith that reads, and it comes in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. So, بسند متصل منا إلى الإمام أحمد رحمه الله تعالى, with a contiguous chain from ourselves through our teachers all the way to Imam Ahmad رحمه الله تعالى. قال, he says, حدثنا, transmitted to us, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i. He says Imam al-Shafi'i transmitted to us. And also notice there's 2 things here. The one is, of course, that Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i is the eponym of the Shafi'i school of thought, the teacher of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. The other thing you notice here is that he says haddathana, which is an explicit form of stating that there was actual transmission that took place. That Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, and this most likely took place in Iraq, because that's where Imam Shafi'i taught Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he transmitted to us. So there was a gathering of people and there was actual transmission that took place there. He's not just reporting from Imam Shafi'i saying an or qala, saying that Imam Shafi'i said. He's saying that there was actual transmission. He then says qala akhbarana. So Imam Shafi'i transmitted, akhbarana, transmitted to us, Malik, his teacher, Malik ibn Anas. That's Imam Malik, the eponym of the Maliki school of thought, who transmits an Nafi', from Nafi', the teacher of Imam Malik, who was one of the most famous teachers of Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he was also the freed slave and student of Ibn Umar. That's Abdullah ibn Umar, rahimahullah ta'ala, the companion who was a very close follower of the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who says, Anna Rasulallah, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, qala, he said, La yabi', should not purchase or should not sell, ba'dukum ala bay'i ba'din. One person should not buy or sell over another person. Meaning that if somebody has established a trade, right, so you go and you buy, somebody else shouldn't come and override your purchase by buying you out, buying you over. The sharh of that is of course dealt with in fiqh. What we are dealing with here is the transmission itself. Now, I've chosen this particular hadith deliberately because you have an example of world-class transmitters. And this is actually known as the silsila al-Dhahabiyyah, the golden chain of transmission within Sunni Islam, according to Imam al-Bukhari. At least the first part of the chain, because that is the part that is really the hadith-centric part, and that is from the Prophet ﷺ till Imam Malik. The addition of Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that makes it even more special. But the first part is known as al-Silsila al-Dhahabiyyah. That is a chain that you can find in all of the Sihah Sitta. You can find it, and it is regarded as one of the highest levels of authenticity in terms of chains of transmission. So what we do when we have a chain of transmission, you take each transmitter and you try and determine whether the transmitter has adala, which is integrity, and whether the transmitter has tamud dabt, which is excellent precision, excellent preservation skills. Together, these two qualities make up a description that we call thiqatun, or reliable. So for the purpose of ease, I've used that term thiqa to describe the transmitters. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he is وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ وَإِلَّا وَحْيُ يُوحَىٰ. He doesn't speak of his own accord. Whatever he speaks is divine revelation that has been given to him. So that is clear. As far as Ibn Umar is concerned, Abdullah ibn Umar is a Sahabi. And the Sunni position as far as the Sahaba are concerned is that if Allah says, رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ, that Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with Allah, and various other verses of praise of the Sahaba, on top of the fact that the Sahaba, they were not all prolific transmitters of hadith. Only a few of them were prolific transmitters, and the rest of them transmitted few ahadith. But because of their closeness to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and to one another, they would easily be able to rectify each other when it comes to the transmission of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ or transmitting from him. And they could easily, and they have done this in fact, where one would say, no, you are wrong, or I've never heard that, can you bring evidence? We've demonstrated this in previous classes. So when it comes to the Sahaba, we don't look for, is this somebody of integrity and is this somebody who is precise? The integrity is basically unquestionable. If you're a Sunni Muslim, we don't even question the Sahaba's integrity. We say, kulluhum udul. All of them are people of integrity, which is what it states over there. As far as the precision is concerned, again, because we know that there was an accurate system of preservation among the Sahaba, and we know the levels of their memories, and we know that only a few of them made it their life's mission to transmit the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Therefore, there's no problem as far as integrity or dabt is concerned among the Sahaba. The next level is, of course, that of the Tabi'een, the Atba'u Tabi'een, and so forth. Now we start investigating. Is the transmitter a person of integrity and a person of tamud dabt? And in each case here, Nafi' is an exquisite, an erudite transmitter of hadith, an erudite scholar of Islam. Malik is the founder of the Maliki school of thought. Shafi'i is the founder of the Shafi'i school of thought, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal is the founder of the Hanbali school of thought. All of them are beyond reputable, right? We don't even really need to have a discussion on that. So based on the fact that we have transmitters who are people of adala, integrity and precision, tamud dabt, the fact that we also know the chain is contiguous. How do we know the chain is contiguous? Because we know without a shadow of a doubt that Imam Ahmad was a student of Imam Shafi'i, that Imam Shafi'i was a student of Imam Malik, that Imam Malik was a student of Nafi' radiallahu ta'ala, and Nafi' was a student of Ibn Umar. He was one of the two main students of Ibn Umar. And we know that Ibn Umar was a Sahabi who transmits from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so you have contiguity. As far as hidden defects in the chain, now you cannot find hidden defects in a chain such as this with only the chain in front of you. But for now, you can take my word for it, there's no hidden defects in this chain. As far as shudud is concerned, right, something being contradicting that which is more authentic, number one, you're not going to find a more authentic chain than the one in front of you, because again, this is considered as one of the most authentic chains, and it's silsilatul dhahabiyyah, the golden chain. And number two, scholars have not pointed out any contradictions as far as this is concerned. So you have a beautiful textbook example of a Sahih hadith. It's not always as easy as this. Sometimes there's differences as far as one particular narrator is concerned or some difficulty. But we'll uncover those as we proceed bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So that covers the first line of Ibn Hajar's Nukhba that we dealt with earlier, as far as what exactly is a Sahih Hadith. Now we look at the second line again, in which he says, وَتَتَفَاوَتُ رُتْبَتُهُ بِتَفَاوُتِ هَذِهِ الْأَوْصَافِ. The rank of a Sahih Hadith can differ based on these descriptions that we've just given you. So integrity is not always going to be the same, Dabt is not always going to be the same, and so on. وَمِن ثَمَّ, from this perspective, قُدِّمَ الصَّحِيحُ الْبُخَارِي. You would first give preference to the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari, ثُمَّ Muslim, ثُمَّ شَرْطُهُمَا. So there's a basic rank that we follow, and this is somewhat more theoretical, because in practice, in Sunni Islam, if a hadith is regarded as authentic, then regardless of whether it comes in both Bukhari and Muslim, or Bukhari or Muslim, or some other source, its value in terms of Islamic law is practically the same as long as you can establish its authenticity. In terms of hadith and hadith value, yes, of course, if a hadith comes first and foremost in both Bukhari and Muslim, then of course this is going to be the highest level of authenticity, and there's a special terminology for this, which I'm sure you've heard before, but bi'idhnillah we'll mention it here anyway. I should have added it to the slide, and that is that the chain is muttafaqun alayh. Muttafaqun alayh. It's a very poorly written Arabic there, but I'm writing on an iPad, so excuse me for that. Muttafaqun alayh is a term we've all heard before. What does it mean? It means that the chain is agreed upon by Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim. Let's try that a second time, inshallah ta'ala, and hopefully we can get it better this time, inshallah. You would generally find this term at the end of a hadith, and it would just indicate to the listener that, look, this is no ordinary hadith. This is a hadith that's found in both the Sahih of Imam al-Bukhari as well as the Sahih of Imam Muslim, rahimahumullah ta'ala. I hope that's somewhat better. Muttafaqun alayh. Then, if it's not muttafaqun alayh, then the next ranking would be hadith found in the Sahih of Imam Bukhari first, then the Sahih of Imam Muslim, then a Sahih hadith that fills the conditions of both Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, then a hadith that is Sahih that fulfills the conditions of Imam al-Bukhari, then a Sahih hadith that fulfills the conditions of Imam Muslim, and then Sahih in general, meaning it doesn't really fill the previous conditions, but that's theoretical, because again, the conditions that we speak about are the same conditions that have been presented here, right? Adala, Tamud Dabt, Ittisalu Sanad, Min Ghayri Mu'alin Wala Shadh. Those are the conditions. Some of them, Imam al-Bukhari was more strict than Imam Muslim, specifically in terms of who he narrates from firstly, and secondly, the idea of established meetings as opposed to possible meetings, and Allah knows best. Now we end off the lesson with a completely new category of hadith. We've covered the Sahih hadith and what it means. But this one here is a completely different category. Or is it? Looking at what we have in front of us, we find, again, adala. We find muttasil sanad. We find ghayru mu'alin. And we find wala shadh. Yet, this is not a Sahih hadith. In fact, this is the definition of al-Hasan li dhatihi, a Hasan hadith. Hasan li dhatihi, meaning Hasan in and of itself. So where's the difference? Of course, the difference is here. That instead of Tamud Dabt, you have Khafifud Dabt. So when a transmitter, any transmitter in the chain, his level of precision or accuracy does not meet the excellence that we spoke about before. In other words, there were occasions where this transmitter didn't transmit exactly the same as what other transmitters did, yet still generally he was reliable enough where he did not make manifest mistakes or go against those who were reliable. So his transmission precision and accuracy is not 100% or even 90%. Perhaps it's somewhere between 60 and 70%. Then you would no longer term such a transmitter as having tamud dabt, but rather khafifud dabt. So that would still be accurate, but it would be slightly less accurate than optimal or than ideal. And that's the only difference between a hadith that is sahih and a hadith that is hasan. And I remind you here, of course, that when we try and rate a particular transmission, it's always going to be based on the weakest link in the chain. So we look at the chain of transmission and you find that of the 7 transmitters in front of you, one of them have khafifud dabt. All of the others have tamud dabt. What would you transmit this as, or what would you grade this as hasan or sahih? Remember, all of the transmitters, 6 of the 7, they have tamud dabt. So they were all of excellent preservation. They have adala, and there's contiguity in the chain, and it's free of mu'al, and it's free of shadh. Would you regard it as a sahih hadith or a hasan hadith? And the answer is clearly a hasan hadith, because the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now, for our lessons, inshallah, we will continuously refer to this map. I'm just using this one because it's convenient, but there are other diagrammatical representations of the science. But in order for us to keep track of where we are at, how much we know and how much there is to cover, I just decided to use this one. What we've covered so far is mutawatir. We've looked at the divisions of ahad in terms of the number of transmissions. And this category was covered in the previous lesson, which deals with hadith bihasbi tariqati wusulihi ilayna. Hadith in terms of how it reached us and the number of chains, adadu turuqihi, the number of chains that had reached us. So that's covered. In this lesson, we started looking at the definition of a sahih hadith. So that is sahih li dhatihi. And now I've also introduced a new concept, hasan li dhatihi, which of course you can see is similar. Very few differences. The only difference is that at some level you have a narrator of khafifud dabt as opposed to tamud dabt. That means that in the next lesson we're going to look at supportive evidence. Sahih li ghayrihi, where it's sahih, but not in and of itself, but rather due to supportive evidence. And hasan li ghayrihi, same thing, where it's not hasan in and of itself, it's actually hasan because of supportive evidence. And this here falls under the general purview bi'atibari darajatihi, of the rank of hadith in terms of its authenticity, which falls under those ahadith which are maqbool, accepted. And in terms of maqbool, accepted ahadith, that of course is going to take us into a discussion on what is rejected, mardood, right, which is a number of different categories, as you can see. So this is just to give you a perspective in terms of where we are at and what we need to cover. What is essential for you as a student at this stage and throughout your study of ulum al-hadith is to make sure you memorize the definitions. Each lesson is going to add on another definition. Each lesson is going to add on another concept, in fact a few. By not memorizing them, by not understanding them, it just means that as soon as you reach the next lesson, you're going to be in more trouble than the previous lesson. So it's essential for you to understand each concept, to memorize each concept as we proceed, if your intention is, of course, to master the standards of hadith terminology as we've explained, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So in conclusion, what have we covered? In this lesson, we've covered the definition of a sahih hadith as a subcategory of how to determine authenticity from ahad. Then we've looked at the conditions of a sahih hadith itself, analyzing each one of them. Then we looked at the application thereof. And then finally we introduced a hasan hadith and the differences between Sahih and Hasan, which is of course going to play out again in the next lesson where we look at supportive evidence, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Until next time, inshallah, jazakumullahu khairan for joining me, and I hope and pray that this was of benefit. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik, nashadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
لا إله